Way back near the end of St. Benedict's Rule for Monasteries, which is the book that governs the Benedictine order, way back at the end of that book, after all the practical points about how many times a day you're supposed to pray, and what kind of shoes you're supposed to wear, and how guests are supposed to be welcomed, almost as an afterthought, there's this small section called, "If a brother is commanded to do impossible things." I love the Rule of Benedict. I love this mix of profound spiritual stuff with very, very earthy, practical things that you find. And I also find that title totally intriguing. It's a brief section, it's just a paragraph long. And it's meant to be used in cases where difficult or impossible tasks are laid on a member of the community. No examples at all are given, so I'm not sure exactly what's being imagined. I'd kind of like to think the paragraph is about really outrageous stuff, like if a senior monk tells a younger monk that he has to move all the books in the library just with his mind, or something like that. But it's probably for much more ordinary occurrences, like being asked to make breakfast for the whole community alone, or to pray for more hours than you think you possibly could with your attention span. No examples are given, but the response is very practical. Try to talk it out with your superior, and if you can't, try to accept the challenge as there for your own good. It's sort of a no-nonsense response, and I think I'd like to know a little bit more about what the request is before I say what I think of that response. But I'm still fascinated by that idea of being asked to do something impossible. Because I think this isn't just some quaint little tidbit from a dusty old book. I think we are asked to do seemingly impossible things all the time, and particularly when it comes to our faith. The call of Jesus is not just to be a generally pretty good person, to pay your taxes and be nice to animals and not write anything too nasty on somebody else's Facebook page. The call is to love your enemies, and not in some pleasant, abstract, religious way, but actually to seek the good of the person you can't stand running into at work, or the person you would rather not see at school. The call of Jesus is to forgive 70 times 7, and not just in some inner theoretical way, but really to work toward the possibility of a new and open future with somebody who has wronged you. The call of Jesus is to work for healing and for mercy and for justice in the world, and not just to think pleasant thoughts about those big ideas, but to actually give yourself over to working for them in the place where you are this very minute. I listened to an interview recently with Sister Simone Campbell, who was one of the nuns on the bus, which was a group of activist Catholic sisters who ended up in the news for their travels around the U.S. advocating for social justice and a federal budget that actually benefited a majority of citizens. The interview was in front of a small audience, and one of the people who approached the microphone with a question was a young university student who clearly admired the work that Sister Campbell had been doing. And she came up to the microphone and said, "So how do you know when you're doing enough? How do you know when you're making enough of a difference?" And that's sort of the question, isn't it? The call of Jesus to care, to heal, to mend can seem like an impossible one that you never simply get to cross off the list and then sit back. So how do you know when you're doing enough? I think the disciples may be getting their first taste of the overwhelming nature of this call at this point we're at in Mark's Gospel. You wouldn't know it at all from the way our reading starts, but they've just returned from their very first experience with being sent out on their own into the world. Earlier in this chapter, Jesus sent the disciples out 2 by 2 with very short packing lists and even shorter lists of instructions. They were to go out and do what he did, preach and heal. And so off they went into the world, armed with very little but that commission. And surprised, they found there was plenty to do. They proclaimed the message, and they cast out many demons, and they anointed with oil many who were sick, and they healed them. By Mark's brief account, all this sounds like a great success. The disciples were busy with the work of the kingdom, and our reading starts with them now gathered back around Jesus to tell him all they had done and all they had taught. I'm not sure whether they were bragging about who was the best healer and demon battler, or whether they were just so excited to tell Jesus that this gospel stuff actually worked. But either way, I think they come back breathless. And either way, they find that the work hasn't let up. People have found them, right where they are. They've showed up ahead of time, like sports fans camped out and waiting for tickets on the night before the match. The crowds are already there. The press of human need is great. It doesn't let up. And we kind of know what that's like, don't we? A glance through the day's news can bring up one example of earth-shaking significance after another. The civil war rages on in Syria. The civil war in South Sudan continues to claim lives and squash communities. The refugees continue to land on European shores in record numbers. Reports of change in our Earth's climate continue to come in with magnitude and effects still something we are barely beginning to understand. We encounter that sort of news on a daily basis. Many in our community work in jobs that put them face to face with it. We're all asked to work for justice and peace in the world, and it can feel like an impossible task we are called to. How do you know when you're doing enough? How do you know when you're making enough of a difference? I don't know just how the disciples felt in that moment, tired from the work they'd been done and facing more of it as far as the eye could see. Maybe they were ready to break down and take off. Maybe they were ready to hunker down and just work like crazy. I'm not sure how they felt in the middle of all that need. But either way, it's then, in that busy, challenging, impossible place, that Jesus says a very strange thing. Come away to a deserted place by yourselves and rest a while. In the midst of your busy life, in the midst of the need, in the midst of all the important things you are called to do and be, rest. Maybe that doesn't immediately sound like such a strange thing for Jesus to say. Maybe you're used to thinking of him as calm and peaceful and inviting, and that's a good thing. But remember, Jesus had a pretty serious to-do list himself. In Luke's words, Jesus came to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Or in John's simplified version, he came so that the world might be saved. It's no small task. And still he rested, often. And still he counseled his disciples to rest. I feel like that might kind of be a dirty word in Geneva. After a year and some months, I'm getting the idea this is not a city that does a whole lot of resting. It's a busy place, a place for movement and change and encounter. And all of it's important. There's no question about that. But rest is the command of Jesus for his disciples at this point in the story. And I think that might be something important for us in that little throwaway line about them not having leisure even to eat. My French teacher last January told the class that a sandwich eaten in front of a computer for lunch is her idea of the end of civilization. I won't ask for a show of hands for how many have done that in the last week, but I can tell you I do it more often than I wish I did. Jesus and the disciples weren't far from this when they regrouped. There was simply too much action for them to eat in peace. And while I don't think eating is exactly the point here, I don't think it's far from the point either. Because when we do everything hurriedly, busily, importantly, when we eat quickly and move quickly and talk quickly and even pray quickly, we can lose the point in all that we're doing. The point that everything we're doing is ultimately about loving, serving, and yes, even enjoying God. When we rest, we do something more than just recharge and take care of ourselves. Yes, we do that, but more importantly, when we rest, we practice the deep trust that is actually at the heart of life. The trust that God does hold the world in love. The trust that God is at work even when we can't see it. And the trust that God can and will and does work through people and means other than us. Of course, rest isn't all we're called to, but it's a gift of God, and when it's missing, we can find that the trust and joy meant to be there at the center of life are missing as well, even in the middle of doing all kinds of good and important work. So somebody will point out that the rest Jesus invites the disciples into in this story doesn't last very long. A verse later, or half a verse, the crowds of shepherdless sheep find them again, and pretty soon Jesus is teaching, yet again. And that's right. But notice something in that passage. It's Jesus doing the work here. The disciples actually aren't mentioned in that section. So it sure sounds to me like he may have let them sit this one out. They'll be called back into action soon enough. But for now, their task is to rest, to trust, to let Jesus be Jesus. And that's something that I think we can't miss. When he is our shepherd, we are called to some pretty impossible seeming stuff and led through some pretty fearsome places. Parched pastures and tangled paths and valleys a little bit more deathly than we wish. But this is the mysterious gift, that even in those places, we find grace. Even in those places, we find the invitation to rest. Even in those places, we find goodness and mercy following us. And even in those places, God spreads a table and invites us to eat in peace, trusting always that it will be enough. Amen. And friends, let's speak a word of that trust together, using the familiar language of Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest the table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.